united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies. Discussion is all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I guess it's already evening, but wow, we have a full house. So we have a lot to get into today. The automotive sector is at a major crossroads. There's a lot of headwinds. We have a trade war courtesy of the US. We have competition from China, a regulatory battle underway that's about to kick off on December 10th. So we have a very simple question to answer today of how does the automotive sector remain competitive? Should be easy enough, right? Well, fortunately, we have a number of experts who are going to help us answer that question. So in a few minutes, we're going to have our sponsor, Frank Nederlander, speak, and a presentation also from our policy division with a report. And then we'll get into our panel in just a few minutes. But first, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to BMW, our sponsor. We really want to make this as dynamic and engaging as possible, so you can answer questions, or put forward questions on Slido. We also have a poll for you all to get us started of which factor do you think most threatens Europe's automotive competitiveness over the next 10 years? We have reliance on non-EU suppliers, trade and geopolitical friction, which seems to be quite popular, gaps in climate and industrial policy, and a slow digital transformation. But first, let me introduce Frank Nederlander, Vice President of Government Affairs for Europe at BMW, to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. Good afternoon. Thank you to Politico and all of you joining us in that discussion about Europe's competitiveness and the future of mobility. Over the past year, we've felt a growing sense of industry model being at threat. Global competition is intensifying, technologies are evolving faster than expected, and the path to climate neutrality, clear in direction, is more complex than everyone thought in implication and execution. This event, and I'm expecting a very vivid discussion later on, is about asking how Europe turns its ambition into action and climate leadership into industrial strength, something which is very important to bring together. Because setting goal, it's not the challenge here. Europe has, in my opinion, no shortage on ambition. The real question is how we deliver that execution at scale, at speed, and in a way Europe keeps its innovation and prosperity at the forefront in a global competition. And being in the industry for quite a while and knowing my company, that's not a theoretical debate. It's about things and decisions we have every day to make here. Europe is at a crossroad. On one hand, and I have to cite him, the Draghi report made it clear, Europe's competitiveness can not longer be assumed. But 1 year later, I think it was about 400 recommendations, most of them had not been implemented yet or taken into concrete action. Personally, I'm missing that whatever it takes moment. Energy cost, supply chain fragility, regulatory complexity are still putting sustained pressure in the industry. And enabling conditions in different markets are uneven across Europe. If you look at the automotive industry, this gap and fragmentation is quite visible. Some countries do have the incentives, to have the infrastructure, they have the permitting to bring things. Other countries throughout Europe do not have it at the same time. And as you know, the race is the same for 27 member states within the next 10 years. And that fragmentation slows us down. By 2030, regulators expect roughly 45% of all car sales in Europe being EV. And you know by 2035, 100% of them should be zero-emission vehicles. But despite this emission, and we see it in day-to-day business, BEV adoption across Europe remains uneven and well below the trajectory needed. I know there are different interpretations of the figures, but just to cite them again, since 2020, BEV shares have developed quite linear and annually averaging less than 3% point per year in increase. If you calculate that, you would just end up at 50% of market share by 2035, something we do not want to see, and something which probably would mean a shrinking market, which we neither want to see. We need the growth, we need it for economy stability, we need it for production, jobs, and prosperity. That's why without a clear and coherent industrial policy, we risk fulfilling our own targets, probably by coming from production outside of Europe, rather than strengthening our own industry. This shift is already visible, as you know it from the imported EV shares sold in Europe, and look at even this year, even some manufacturers were pooling with them to reach 2025 targets this year. So that's not to say we fear competition, but competition drives innovation, and there's a need to have the right framework conditions to have a level playing field to all the European industry. And when I say that, and well, to be very clear on that, I don't mean protectionism. I need flexibilities in terms of how to deliver those targets. Our task is not to slow down the transition, it's to make it work by connecting climate ambitions with economic realism, and by ensuring that Europe's climate leadership is also a source of its industrial strengths. So how to find the right balance? We all know there's a debate intensifying, especially in the 3 weeks coming up, about 2030, about 2035 targets, about technologies, about zero emission, what it should mean, and there are different perspectives for sure. But, and that's my hope here, it cannot be a contest between industry and policymakers, between ambition and pragmatism. We share the same goal, having a climate-neutral, competitive Europe. Probably we do not share the same view on how to come to that, and therefore our challenge, and that's something for today, for the upcoming weeks, and the ongoing process, it's about aligning tools and timelines so that this ambition remains achievable and socially sustainable for workers, consumer, and the environment. Let me offer 3 short thoughts on how to move forward. First, we think we need a smarter CO2 counting. If Europe wants to see real progress, we must ensure that we measure the right things. A significant share, and I think everyone is aware of that, of vehicles' total footprint is determined long before it drives on the road. Today, too much focus, in our opinion, is focused on the tailpipe emission. But the real story begins much earlier, in materials, in production, energy use, and ultimately in recycling. And that's why we need a more complete picture on the whole life cycle, a picture that captures decarbonization wherever it happens in the value chain. And at our company, we see the impact of life cycle assessment every day using, for example, CO2-reduced steels or secondary aluminum, and that cuts emission along the vehicle and long before the vehicle reaches the road. For example, the current new BMW iX3 has up to 35% of less CO2 in its life cycle compared to this previous model, exactly by using those methods. So that smart measuring counts, and by the way, it's the basis to be compliant both in reporting or in accounting standards. So we have to bring those perspectives together. Second, again, I know a difficult topic, stay technology open. Electrification is vital, no doubt about that, but not singular. Plug-in hybrids, hydrogen, renewable fuels all have a role to play. And no other region in the world is de facto banning technologies. I keep repeating that. Staying technology open is about bringing the progress and make it scalable, affordable, and resilient in the way to accelerate zero. Again, it's not about questioning the targets, it's about how to do that. And that's exactly how we work. We are advancing a broad portfolio, electric drivetrains, highly efficient plug-in hybrids, combustion engine, which are also today capable on renewable fuels like HVO 100, which, as you know, cuts life cycle CO2 emission by 90%. And probably that's the reason why today, even in that turbulent time, we as a company are navigating a little better than others. And last but not least, in 2028, we are launching our first series production hydrogen vehicle, the next generation of BMW iX5 hydrogen. And its fuel cell system will be here in Europe, strengthening resilience, reducing dependency, and expanding Europe's strategic autonomy. As I said, we strongly believe that's the way forward to remain competitive and keeps innovation achievable in Europe. Third, of course, link green and the digital transformation, so artificial intelligence, automation, advanced manufacturing are already reshaping Europe's industrial base. Actually, Europe is also leading in that respect. We have one example, for instance, the Catena X platform is the first collaborative data ecosystem between both OEMs and supplier, measuring all data throughout the life cycle and giving you the opportunity to use those data in our industry network. And within the company, we see the transformation firsthand. Our new plant in Debrecen, producing, by the way, the iX3 I mentioned, is the first facility to operate fully virtually, even before the first car leaves the factory. It uses digital twins, AI-supported planning, data-driven processes to cut time, resources, and emission from day one. To stay ahead, and that's my message here, we need an innovation-friendly framework. A framework that fosters innovation, secure access to critical ingredients such as semiconductors and the cloud capacity, and some which enables Europe on technology as confidential as it is on engineering. Let me last add perhaps a fourth thought, a very difficult easy, which is mentioned also by Jordan earlier on. We cannot ignore the global competition. Europe's strength had always been its openness. And in a world of shifting alliances and new trade tensions, I think this openness still matters. I believe our resilience will depend on partnerships and not isolation. For our sector, this is absolutely clear. Trade supports nearly 40 million European jobs and generates 117 billion trade surplus for the EU. That's real prosperity. It's built on global connections, of course, and these have been shown very fragile over the last year. Just remember the chip shortage recently, where a small piece, even not high-tech, could slow down the whole system. But keep in mind, there's no way to unwire that global interconnectivities. More autonomy in critical area, yes, but completely inefficient that everyone would produce everything everywhere. And now with scaling up electromobility, new dependencies emerge. As you know, China dominates much the global battery production and on key material. The concentration that carries a real strategic disadvantage for Europe. And this disadvantage, if ever, can only be overcome with more time, massive investments, capabilities to access and process raw materials, but also having technology alternatives and not forget strategic partnership. That's why we cannot close our border. That's why we cannot give up rules-based trade, diversify supply chains and technology, and close our cooperation with like-minded region. But it's also why we cannot stop partnering with challengers like China and maintain a connection to those leading innovation ecosystems. That's what will give Europe its cutting edge. So I will let you with that. Europe's competitiveness will be shaped by the same forces shaping our industry: decarbonization, digitalization, and the global trading system. We cannot treat them as separate debates. They are one challenge, one shared responsibility, and in a democracy, a challenge of this scale comes with our responsibility to make openly the choices, to build a consensus, and to ensure that this transition works for both citizen and the industry. So the real question remains how to do it together, how do we turn ambitions into outcomes and translation into industrial strengths. And ladies and gentlemen, the task we share is to move with a common purpose. Not by chance, not by pressure, but by design. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Frank. All right, let's dive in. Please welcome to the stage Politico's own Amanda Crayley, Research and Data Analyst, and Christelle Papy, Head of Policy and Intelligence, to present the report.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation brought to you by Politico Research and Analysis Division. We're a new intelligence unit within Politico, which launched roughly almost 3 years ago, and we specialize in independent data analysis and policy research. Today, we'll be presenting the findings of our 3-part research series, in which we have focused on the geopolitical fragmentation, industrial competition, and climate policy that are reshaping Europe's competitiveness. Our lens, of course, is the automotive sector, which sits at the heart of these dynamics, as we've just heard from our sponsor. Our research traces 3 storylines. First of all, rising trade pressures, which have exposed Europe's strategic dependencies. The global race for digital innovation, which are being led in this moment by the US and China, and that are challenging Europe on scale, technological transformation, and adaptability. And finally, the intersection of climate policy and industrial strategy, in which we have explored how Europe can advance decarbonization while strengthening its competitiveness. But the purpose of our work is not just to benchmark where Europe stands, it's to highlight the leverage points that Europe can use in order to actually increase its competitive edge on the global landscape.
It's just here on the chair.
Oh, thank you. So let's dive right in. Perfect. Our story begins by looking at how US, China, and Europe are all racing towards decarbonization. However, they vary in ambition and in structure. And of course, we know that Europe has one of the most comprehensive regulatory framework that it launched, of course, under the Green Deal in the last mandate. And it has set for its own target to reach climate neutrality by 2050 and a 55% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030. And in this simplified timeline here on the left, we can see some of the key measures aimed to bring all of this together. However, if we zoom in on Europe, not yet, okay, we can see that road transportation is actually one of its biggest emissions for Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. However, we understand how this has placed the automotive sector at the heart of a clean tech transition. However, this is meant to be achieved through a series of regulatory frameworks, amongst which, of course, the emissions trading system, ETS2 to be exact, which will launch in 2027. And it will extend carbon pricing to road transport and buildings and gradually raise fossil fuel costs to nudge the market towards low carbon alternatives. And then the other side of this coin is the CO2 performance standards, which we have put together here on the graph on the right. It specifically will require fleet-wide reductions of 55% by 2030 and 100% by 2035 for new passenger cars. And under these new standards, only battery electric and hydrogen vehicles qualify as zero emission. So all internal combustion engines, including e-fuels and biofuels, are excluded. And this presents a clear pathway for what Europe's regulatory framework and what is the future of the automotive sector explicitly. It's meant to be electric. However, having a very robust regulatory framework doesn't automatically translate into industrial leadership. And the first visual here on the left for you tells an important story. It shows that average passenger car emission trajectories through 2036 amongst China, the US, and the EU. And while Europe has the steepest regulatory curve, which is proof of its ambition, actually China and the US are moving faster in scaling clean tech production. And the second visual here on the right explains why. Transport, which is here in the bottom right corner, is more carbon intensive and economically significant, meaning that decarbonizing mobility is technically complex, it's costly, and it's deeply interlinked with Europe's competitiveness. So this tension defines the moment that we're in. Europe is leading on regulation, but others are instead accelerating on industrial execution. Second. Okay.
And this brings us to innovation. So on the left, you see R&D spending in autos and parts. Europe continues to invest heavily, but China has almost tripled its spending since 2015 and is rapidly narrowing the gap. On the right, the picture is even clearer. China now leads in transport-related patents, surpassing 50% of global output, while Europe's has slipped. The main point is that Europe spends a lot on R&D, but it converts that spending into market-shaping innovation much more slowly than China. And this brings us to how Europe's industrial engine is adapting, or in many ways struggling to adapt, to the clean tech transition. As the chart on the top left shows, global EV uptake is now overwhelmingly powered by China. It accounts for the largest share of battery electric and plug-in hybrid sales worldwide, far ahead of Europe and the US. And rapid domestic adoption has given Chinese manufacturers the scale advantage that anchors their global leadership. On the supply side, bottlenecks persist too. Europe's infrastructure development is improving, but slower grid connections, fragmented permitting, and uncertain business models continue to hold back growth elsewhere. And at the same time, industrial capacity hasn't scaled fast enough. European automakers, historically global leaders, hesitated to ramp up BEV production. And that hesitation opened up space for China, where the share of electric and hybrid vehicles rose from under 10% of sales in 2021 to over 50% by 2024. And that growth wasn't accidental. It reflects 2 decades of coordinated industrial policy. And here we can see the outcome. China now produces far more vehicles than its domestic market consumes, while Europe and North America remain net importers. Through its dual circulation policy, which strengthens domestic supply chains while pushing exports outward, vertically integrating everything from raw materials to batteries to final assembly, and backing it with subsidies and state financing, China has achieved 2 things. So 1, it's overtaken Europe and the US in EV production between 2021 and 2024, and it paired that growth with the world's largest network of fast chargers. So together, scale and infrastructure create a reinforcing cycle, lowering costs, accelerating adoption, and enabling Chinese firms to commercialize faster at home and dominate abroad. So while China's strategy is tightly coordinated, Europe's approach has been far more uneven. Northern and Western producers have expanded their BEV lines, but much of the battery and material supply chains still come from outside of the EU, and high energy prices continue to squeeze already very slim margins. So if you look at the left, the visual behind me, you can see how Europe's automotive center of gravity has shifted eastward. So Eastern European countries now produce nearly a third of all EU passenger cars. And this growth isn't just about lower labor costs, it's driven by skilled workers, national incentives, and EU funding that scaled production close to Western markets. But even with these gains, the high-value R&D and intellectual property still mostly sit abroad. And without deeper technology transfer and local integration, these hubs risk remaining assembly centers and not innovation centers. And this other chart on the right makes that gap clear. It compares R&D spending and market capitalization across leading automakers in China, Germany, and the US. Europe, and Germany in particular, still invests heavily in R&D. But if we look at the market capitalization below, US and Chinese firms are still pulling ahead and turning innovation into scale and market value much faster. And that's really the crux of this challenge. Europe remains strong in engineering and regulation, but it's lagging in digital integration, scale, and speed. And this challenge becomes even clearer when we look at Europe's performance in digitalization and innovation. So while US factories are improving in automation, Europe still lags in industrial robot density and high impact patents for land transportation. This tension defines the moment we're in. Europe risks settling into the role of a premium hardware supplier without controlling the data, software, and platforms that increasingly define value in mobility. It's good to have extra time to take in the visuals.
Well, building on what Amanda just said, everything is further compounded by the external resource dimension. Europe is far too reliant on foreign suppliers for critical raw materials, especially lithium, magnesium, and rare earths, which are all key critical raw materials needed for automotive technologies and its components. And the map here explains to you exactly why that is. It's because China dominates both extraction and refining of the majority of these raw materials. And even in its trade tensions with the US, we have seen that it has tightened its export controls, albeit now these have been suspended for the next year, but still these have caused costly delays to Europe. And in the bottom left chart here that you can see, the trade patterns between the EU and China specifically, this asymmetry is unmistakable because Europe is exporting premium cars and industrial machinery, but imports far larger volumes of electronics and components. So this imbalance is more about trade patterns. It really demonstrates the strategic dependence that Europe has. And we are absorbing, there we go. Okay. And all of this is further compounded by what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. We have seen now with a trade deal that was agreed upon during the summer that what was expected to be a 27.5% scenario has now decreased to 15%. However, this still dwarfs to what was a previous most favored nation rate of 2.5%. And this is not to even mention the higher tariffs that are going to be for steel, aluminum, and motorcycles. All of this is really just to illustrate the global context and what it adds complexity to Europe's current regulatory framework and what that means to achieve decarbonization. But what is Europe doing about it? So first of all, a lot of the emphasis has been on the supply chain front and increasing its resilience. So as we can see on the left graph, this demand for critical raw materials is expected to grow, and as a result, various key initiatives have been launched, notably, of course, the Critical Raw Materials Act in 2024, which will cap reliance on any one single country at 65%, and it also supports new projects across the EU. The map here on the right represents 47 of these projects launched across 13 of member states, which will cover critical raw materials such as lithium, aluminium, magnesium, and many more, which, as we've seen, are critical for the automotive sector. Then we have the upcoming Circular Economy Act, which will target the other side of the equation, that of recovery and reuse, and helping build a secondary raw material base within the EU. And finally, we have seen that now there's going to be the launching of a new Resource EU plan, which will be focused on diversifying and stockpiling supplies through joint purchasing, recycling, and new global partnerships. All of this to help expand Europe's network of its CRM partners.
The EU is also under pressure to accelerate digital innovation. To this end, Europe must build a skilled workforce and resilient industrial ecosystem. Today, only 11% of EU enterprises have integrated AI, and digital adoption across industries continues to lag. The visual behind me shows the 2030 Digital Decade targets and Europe's progress in 2024 across key areas, highlighting just how far the EU still needs to go. To address these gaps, the Commission has launched a dense and complementary policy roadmap. The measures in this roadmap represent concrete progress, but full implementation will take time. When discussing decarbonizing mobility, the focus often falls on tailpipe emissions. This is where life cycle assessment comes in. It provides a cradle-to-grave view of emissions, measuring energy use, material consumption, waste, and carbon output at every stage. Importantly, battery production, steel, aluminium, and logistics account for a substantial share of total emissions, meaning policies that focus solely on CO2 tailpipe emissions risk overlooking the bigger picture. Potential outcomes under best-case scenarios illustrate why LCA is important. According to the International Energy Agency, a typical petrol car generates about 54 tons of CO2 over the full life cycle, compared to 37 tons for a plug-in hybrid and 25 tons for a battery electric vehicle, assuming fully renewable electricity and low carbon supply chains. Similarly, the International Council on Clean Transportation finds that BEVs under ideal conditions can reach the lowest life cycle emissions of any technology after roughly 17,000 kilometers. These figures highlight the importance of accounting for upstream emissions across all drivetrain options. Other vehicles could achieve similar life cycle improvements with decarbonized fuels, materials, or energy inputs. And together, these insights suggest that integrating LCA can help capture real emissions across all technologies involved in the construction of a vehicle, while upholding the technology neutrality principle, also in line with the recommendations in the Draghi report. We're already seeing early signs of these considerations in the EU's regulatory framework. Beyond the batteries regulation and CBAM, while CO2 performance standards still focus primarily on tailpipe emissions, a key provision, Article 7, requires the Commission to develop a common methodology for reporting full vehicle lifecycle emissions by 2025. And this marks a significant step forward towards policies that capture not just tailpipe output, but the emissions embedded across the entire vehicle lifecycle. And in this context, the upcoming regulatory review, expected in December, will be a pivotal moment.
So, to conclude, we see how Europe risks becoming a regulatory power without its industrial weight to support it. Yet at the same time, this regulatory depth is also one of its greatest strategic assets, because by embedding life cycle thinking into its ambitious climate frameworks, Europe can compete not just on cost or efficiency, but also on credibility, on transparency, and long-term sustainability, which are all qualities that are reshaping global markets today. So Europe already has set the global standards for its climate ambition. The challenge now is turning that into a regulatory leadership, but also an industrial reality. And to do this, we have seen that it needs to achieve three main things, and therefore also answering the poll that we have launched for you. It needs to scale industrial and digital capacity, invest strategically in clean technologies, and most importantly, aligning industrial competitiveness with its genuine decarbonization. So the real question isn't just how fast Europe can decarbonize, but how it can reconcile its climate policy and industrial strategy, not just as competing forces, but as two sides of the same race. Thank you so much for your attention. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into our research, please scan the QR code here on the slide behind me, and I'll leave a word to my colleague Amanda.
Yeah, we'll now move to our panel with our expert speakers. Please stay seated. We'll begin after a quick stage change, and in the meantime, a round of applause for our upcoming panel. Thank you so much.
I'll stay, right? Do I need to introduce the panel? All right. Thank you, everyone, for sitting tight with us. Really excited to get started with you all. So let's jump right in. On December 10th, it's our Automotive D-Day. The Commission is going to be dropping a package that includes an expected reform of the 2035 legislation, a battery booster package, greening corporate fleets mandate, and as if that was not enough, an Industrial Accelerator Act that is expected to include local content requirements for the sector under the guise of making it competitive. So first I want to start with you all. What are you expecting to be in this package, and perhaps more crucially for you, what should it include? Sigrid, why don't we start with you from the sector perspective?
Wonderful, thank you. Hello, everyone. You forgot one, Jordan. There's also going to be a regulatory streamlining proposal, omnibus for automotive.
How could I forget?
Very important to strengthen the competitive framework here in Europe, because we just heard Europe is a regulatory power, but without the industrial weight. And I think indeed that's the challenge also for the Commission to get right. And what we hope for is really a bold, courageous package on the 10th of December that will contain actual and fundamental change. The courage and the boldness should be, in our view, in recognizing that the framework needs fixing. It doesn't need a U-turn, it doesn't need changing in all the ways it's been laid out, but it needs additional components to make it work better. We already heard it from some of the previous speakers. We need to really make sure that decarbonization and competitiveness and resilience, so security of supply, are better matched, so that we move from a very strict regulatory straitjacket to being smart by design. And to also make sure then that we arrive at a self-propelling transformation, because I think that's where we need to be. And that's where we can also learn, for example, from other places in the world, like China, that had the framework more in place in a synchronized, coherent way. And so what Europe needs is more market orientation, accounting for global developments, the flexibility to adjust. And that will, we believe, drive the scale again as well that we desperately need to make sure there is, and there continues to be, a thriving auto industry in Europe that also has the revenues to then deliver also on electric vehicles that are currently still higher in cost to build, but also in cost to, or in price to buy. Doubling down on demand measures, on infrastructure, very important. A 3-lane approach, so we need dedicated policies for passenger cars, but also for light commercial vehicles. It's a different business model, and for heavy-duty vehicles, that's important. We need the value chain to work better, to be more competitive. We need a global approach still to have the partnerships, to have access to components and supply, and we need workforce transformation as much as well. And then we, can work together to make mobility, so both producing all these wonderful vehicles, but also driving them, a source of pride again, because we still have a lot of going for us as Europe and also as auto industry. So EVs will and they must become mainstream There's no turning back. There's only one way forward, but we simply now need to fix the framework and make it work.
So a very small list. That should be doable,
But
right?
it's right before Christmas, so, you know.
Lucy, I want to turn to you. You focus a lot on charging and infrastructure. From your standpoint, how should those gaps and issues be addressed in this package?
So I would dispute that there are gaps, but for this particular package, we don't necessarily expect a big focus on EV charging infrastructure. What we're going to keep an eye on is for sure the corporate fleet initiatives. For us, it is really, really crucial that Europe does a little bit more to sustain EV demand. It's one side of the equation that has been a little bit overlooked. It is a little bit strange that corporate fleets are electrifying at a slower pace than private cars, right? You would expect corporations to be able to do more. That's the case for Belgium, and that's it. The rest of European countries, you know, you're seeing a pattern of corporate fleets actually getting greener at a slower pace than, you know, private households. So there's a lot of potential here. So that's one big bucket that we're looking at. Of course, the other big bucket is the review of the CO2 standard for cars proposal. Our sector, it's not a secret, is investing massively in deploying EV charging infrastructure. Also not a secret that, you know, we're not profitable today. We're not going to be profitable before years. And when I say years, I don't mean 2 years, and I don't even mean 5. I mean way down the line. And to be able to continue those investments, we need policy predictability and clarity and security for the investors who are supporting us in that journey. Otherwise, they will look at, you know, those frameworks being rolled back one by one. There's the CO2 standard for cars proposal. There's ETS2 that is now being pushed into, you know, further away, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and difficulties in the discussion that we have with investors.
Sarah, I want to turn to you because for as much as the sector may have desires, competing desires perhaps, ultimately this is going to go before the Council and the Parliament. What has a likelihood of actually passing and making it through different discussions in Parliament? What is your take on that?
Well, I think first and foremost, what we've seen also in the presentation before this panel and also in the speech, of course, is that what we can learn from the Chinese is really to have that long-term view, massive investments, making sure indeed that the way forward is crystal clear for everyone. And I do think that some of those things have been lacking in our European approach. And I think it's good that now, while we are focusing on the debate on competitiveness, we do answer some of those questions that have been lacking when it comes to, for instance, how are we going to green our industry? What is really needed to make that happen? And so in that sense, I'm expecting a lot from the Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act. I still call it that because I do think it's important to keep the decarbonization part very clear, because I do see and believe that the best thing we can do for our competitiveness is actually greening our industry. And I mean, to me, it needs to come together with some of the enabling conditions that have already been mentioned. And indeed, I mean, corporate fleets, the greening of corporate fleets is one of those policy examples that I'm really looking forward to. As a Belgian, I can tell you that it works. So I would love to see how the Commission will indeed support member states to also roll out these kind of schemes, because we see that there's a huge take-up of EV. We see that the charging infrastructure is actually following. We see that this also creates a lot of, I would say, good quality second-hand EVs, etc. And indeed, of course, charging infrastructure is important. I would also look at for instance, social leasing that has been a great success in France. I mean, I think these kind of best examples need to be shared and need to be amplified. What I'm hoping won't happen is that we will dive into a discussion on our CO2 targets, where yet again there is no certainty, there is no clarity on the way forward. And with the current parliament, I have to say, I'm a bit afraid of the chaos that might incur once you open all of that up again. And there is no reason to do so, honestly, because if you look at the policy, it's actually working. We are getting our targets. There is only one car manufacturer that wasn't able to meet them, and there was actually, you know, a plan B, let's put it that way, to make sure that fines would not occur. We see a huge take-up of EV. For instance, look at Volkswagen, where in the last year they have a surge of 90% of their sales. You see that, for instance, battery costs are expected to, well, decrease by 28% in 2027, which will make sure that we get more affordable EVs on the market. And I mean, they have already been introduced. So I'm a bit puzzled why, at the moment where policy is working, where we are working on those enabling conditions, we would actually open everything up again and start discussing amongst ourselves. I mean, sorry, but the industry of the future is not going to be won by relying on the technology of the past. I think that the Chinese have shown us that very well, and if we now don't stay the course, I think we might as well hand our car industry on a silver platter to the Chinese.
Ignacio, I do want to turn to you on trade, but first, Sigrid, I want to give you an opportunity to respond. I saw you reacting to a couple of the remarks.
Yeah, the corporate fleets, it's a wonderful example of where you don't really need regulation, but you can work with fiscal measures within a national context, and it works. So it's more about incentivizing than about yet new prescribing new targets or giving new mandates. And you know, on the one hand, we can, as Europe and as European auto industry, already tell a great story, because it's remarkable how far we have progressed already in this transformation. It's just that we haven't reached the mainstream yet. There is no mass market yet. So today we're at about 17% of market share for battery electric vehicles in Europe, new sales. We would need to be at 25%, so that's a pretty huge gap. And by 2030, we would need to be above 50% of sales. So these are quite significant steps to achieve. We're confident we can get there if there is a bit more flexibility so that we can work with the market. So there you get into hybrid technologies, range extenders to ease the transformation, and also by indeed still doubling down on infrastructure measures and being more consistent as EU in supporting demand, and also look at things like scrappage schemes or fleet renewal schemes, so that you indeed have a healthy used car market that you help develop, but also create stimulus to make this work. So there is no need to entirely change tech, but to do it in a smarter way, use regulation where it applies best, but also, and we believe predominantly, go for incentivization. We could expand this discussion to European preference or EU-made and local content, and I'm sure Ignacio may also get into that, because there is a trade element there. But again, there you run the risk that you start with prescription, that you go to the drawing board. Let's, paint our ideal picture of what the EU should look like and the whole framework. And then we expect that a map, a model of the world actually is the real world. Well, it isn't. And I think we're seeing that today. And we should be bold and courageous and smart enough to adapt and change and learn.
Perfect segue, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, Ignacio, is about local content requirements. The industry is really divided about this. Some think this should be only made in the EU. Some want the UK and Norway to be included. Others want countries that have free trade agreements with the EU. How does that work from a trade policy perspective, and is that WTO compliant?
Well, thanks a lot for that question, although allow me to make perhaps before a bit of a more general comment, because I think I heard with a lot of satisfaction the indication that the car industry is an internationally competitive industry, and therefore is strongly committed to openness and rule-based trade. I think that's an extremely important statement. I think it's clear that the industry is going to go through a period of difficult adjustments to new technological requirements and to new sources of competition, and that you need to have a trade and industrial policy which is coherent to support that process of transformation. But I would argue it needs to be a trade and industrial policy which is consistent with our international commitments and consistent with our objective of working with our partners. So that would be the first comment. And secondly, you need to look holistically to the challenge of China, because it affects so many aspects of what the industry is going to have to experience. So local content requirements, no question that those would be WTO incompatible, and they will be incompatible with our free trade agreements. In my view, there are smarter ways to achieve the objective, because I totally agree that one of the things that one should look into is how to coordinate incentives at the European level, the incentives which are being provided by member states, whether it is for passenger cars or whether it is for corporate fleets, and to see how those incentives could be coordinated on the basis of common criteria. You could do that without using local content requirements. You could use, for instance, a cleverly designed carbon footprint requirement that could be defended under the international rules on trade and which would achieve, in practice, a very similar type of objective. So in my view, before jumping into something just because it sounds politically attractive, it is much better to look into a more clever way to achieve your objectives and to do it in a manner which is not going to create immediately conflicts with so many of our trading partners. I mean, free trade agreement has been a very important part of the policy of the European Union. We have free trade agreement with so many important players in the car sector, and entering into a situation of conflict with them, I think in my view would be a big, big mistake. By the way, that also shows that another of the important issues is how to move forward to get the ratification of those free trade agreements which are going to be important to open export opportunities for our car industry. And that's Mercosur, that's India, that's Indonesia, etc., etc. Now, I also wanted to talk about China, but I think I will come back to you onto that later.
We'll be
so
talking
I
about
would
that a little
say
bit later.
I would really recommend not to go in the direction of local content requirements.
Okay, bold proclamation from our trade expert here. Part of that, of course, is about batteries. They're the most expensive part of an electric vehicle. They're also the most important part, both technologically and, of course, powering the actual vehicle. But Europe does not have a battery sector for the most part. Northvolt died earlier this year. They've been somewhat reinvigorated, but to a much smaller scale. So how can Europe still deliver a homegrown battery sector? Is that still a realistic strategy? Sarah, what do you think?
Well, it's not just going to magically appear. That's very clear. I'm expecting a lot from the battery booster. I think it's important that this is indeed one of those crucial things within the supply chain that we need to have more control over. I don't think it's as simple as just saying, okay, now we are on our own as Europe going to revamp the battery production and then all will be well. I think we need to acknowledge that right now when it comes to technology, the Chinese are really far ahead. But for me, it would be then more important to, for instance, look at tech transfer, at joint ventures, at making sure that we actually have access to this technology, but that we also have the security that not everything is made outside of Europe, because I'm sure that many of you, and I mean it was in the poll just earlier, are apprehensive about the fact that we don't have the full control on that supply chain, and I mean rightfully so. If you indeed look at some of the actions of the Chinese when it comes to chips and you know, specific car parts. So I think it's gonna ask a lot of investment. I think it's gonna ask a lot of planning, also on the European level, so not just the member state initiative. But I do think, realistically, this is not something we are going to do just on our own. And if I talk to car makers, I recently went to Munich, for instance, to talk to the BMW leaders. This is also what I hear. Right now, we are too dependent. We need to find a way to work together with the Chinese, but under conditions, of course.
I want to turn to a bit of a wonky topic. Bear with me. Climate is at the heart of 2035. It's why that legislation was put into place to begin with. China has been moving ahead. The US has been moving ahead also with plug-in hybrids. That is now a really big ask of the auto sector in Europe. But the Commission has a new change around how to calculate the emissions from these plug-in hybrids. It's something called the utility factor, which is why I said it's wonky. Bear with me. And this is essentially how much a consumer is driving on a combustion engine versus the electric part. And the real world emission tests show that people are driving much more on the combustion engine, which is why the Commission wants to change that calculation. But the sector, for the most part, is opposing this change. And Sigrid, I wanted to ask you why that is and what should be put in place instead.
Because I think industry would like us all to work on what the actual issue is, and that is making use of the technology in the way it's intended to make use of. And so by just, tweaking the regulation a little bit, you don't get there. You need to convince people, and for that they need to have the charging infrastructure. It could be fiscally, stimulated or incentivized to drive actually in electric mode. There are technologies, it's clear that there are some deficiencies and that improvements are needed, and industry works also to deliver the solutions for that. And there are technologies that could help people drive their vehicles more as they are intended to, so that you drive in electric mode within city centers where it matters most, for example, but that you use the longer range that comes with a hybrid vehicle, plug-in hybrid vehicle, when you need that. It could be in the weekend or to do longer trips. So again, this is, I think, part of this transformation, which is de facto a systemic transformation. It's not just about putting a different technology in a vehicle. It's about new mobility habits, needing an infrastructure that fits, using measures to induce people, to nudge them also into new ways of using vehicles and to driving, making it also, making it more normal and making it more of a habit to work with these technologies as they can be and they should be, and then they can make a contribution to decarbonization. We saw the graph also on the screen. Combustion engine vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and battery electric vehicles over the life cycle as well. And there is no one solution, no one silver bullet.
But to be clear, this isn't saying plug-in hybrids should not be allowed. This is simply what the calculation of how much emissions do these cars actually produce. And then, of course, that would go to the automakers of how many of these would go toward the emission targets.
Yeah.
Lucy, you've done quite a bit of research into this. I want to give you a chance to respond.
At the heart of that question, you have data, and that's really important. The data says the plug-in hybrids pollute 3.5 times more than what they're registered for. That's not my data, that's the data of the European Commission, so it's not really questionable. So faced with that gap between what's happening in the lab and what's happening in real life, the Commission has very understandably said we need to address that and correct that deviation, right? So that is planned for 2026, 2027, and subsequently, which is the way it should be. And I think it is completely bonkers that today we're having a discussion about how perfectly fine it is to be ignoring data and to be ignoring science as a completely acceptable way to be navigating the current difficulties. It is bonkers, and we should know better, because we went through Dieselgate, and it shouldn't be a discussion about how we should cheat the system again. It should be a discussion of how we win the transition, right? But you can never be on the side of non-data, non-science. I became aware of that ask, not personally, but through an MEP who's not from the Green, he's from the center, and he's from the leadership of the center. And it was an event on comparing hybrid and BEV and which is the most efficient technology, etc. And he actually called out the suppliers who went in the room and he said, I don't understand how I'm receiving a letter from you asking to not proceed with the correction of the utility factor. It's a disgrace. And that's his word, okay? From the center, from the leadership. I cannot say who it is because it would shut them rooms, but I think we're really not doing ourselves any favor by ignoring the lessons from the past, by ignoring the data, by ignoring the science.
So now we're going from wonky to bonkers and disgraceful. No, I think you cannot just look at data from yesterday. You need to look what is the future. You need to also recognize that customers and consumers want transitional technology to make that transition towards full electric. I could put to Lucy that the business model of her community is to have as many pure electric vehicles on the roads as possible. I get that, but again, the world is more complicated. It's not a simple thing to solve this, and we need all these technologies in the best way possible, and I think we can work on that also together as industry and policymakers. But to put these kind of terminologies on serious technologies and serious concerns that also consumers have, I would like to stay away from that.
Sarah, you're having quite some reactions.
I mean, I would think as a consumer, you would want to have the right data and actually know what the reality of the emissions are and not be lied to, as indeed has been the case before, talking about Dieselgate. So I don't get what the problem would be by actually objectifying the data. And I mean, sorry to say, but it's a false solution to a problem that actually doesn't exist. I mean, for so many people, of course, it is going to ask a change in behavior, but it's not insurmountable. It's not like, this is actually going to, let's say, have a change in their quality of life or in their mobility, or it's not the case. And the emissions are very, it's very clear. I think I've even seen numbers where it's 5 times more. You say 3.5. I guess a lot depends indeed on how you use it. But I really don't understand what we would gain by actually putting this kind of carbon lock-in forward as a solution. What we need to make sure of is that indeed the enabling conditions are there. The charging infrastructure, the transparency when it comes to the charging cost, making sure indeed that our highways are equipped with enough of high-speed charging infrastructure and all of that. But to say now, in this day and age, where it's so crystal clear, and I mean, big parts of car industry are actually saying it themselves, that the electrical vehicle is the best technology, is the way forward, I think you are kidding, or you are, let's say, misconstruing what a lot of civilians are actually, they need to make a choice. They need to make a choice now for a car that is probably going to last 10, 15 years. If you now tell them, you know what, hybrid is also fine, I think you're lying to them.
Sigrid, I want to give you a chance to respond before we move on to the next topic.
No, again, we're in a transition. We're not moving from combustion engine today to pure electric tomorrow. And in a transition, you need to take people with you, and you need to offer them also the opportunity to do so across Europe, not just in cities, but also outside of cities, and also in countries that have a different layout. First point. So what we see today, and that's also detrimental to decarbonization efforts, is that people are holding on to their cars longer. So, I mean, it would be better to renew the fleet also with low emission, low carbon vehicles before even going to fully electric, because you make better progress with your decarbonization agenda. Third point, and I could have many more, but I'll leave it with at 3. China, doing great, poster child. is not banning a technology. They are coming out with their next 5-year plan. Next year, they've already, did some curtain raisers. They're not banning a technology, and they talk about electrified vehicles, which is pure battery electric vehicles, but also plug-in hybrid, range extenders. And why do they do that? Because they know very well that mobility needs are very different, but also that as a country and as an economy, you need some safety nets. So they're investing in hydrogen, but they are not discarding further developing internal combustion engine vehicles for very, very good reasons. So you can do and. You can decarbonize, have a thriving industry, competitive, and be resilient as an economy. And I think that should be our shared goal. That's what we're working towards.
China continues to come up, of course. They are the bit of the boogeyman of the sector. So, Ignacio, you wanted to touch upon earlier about global competition, and of course, none of these companies are operating in a bubble. So, how does Europe stack up globally, and how should this conversation play into that?
Yeah, let me focus just on China, although of course there's also the challenge coming from the United States, the challenge relating to our free trade negotiation. But let me just focus on China, because I think it's clear that China is at the center of quite a few of the challenges which are being experienced by the car industry. And I think ideally it would be preferable if one could deal with those issues in a partnership mode and in a holistic manner. But it's only going to be possible if there's a unified European Union position and if there is leverage in case leverage needs to be exercised. So in my view, you need to look into the different aspects of the relationship with China. There's, of course, import competition. We have taken the right choice, which is to use WTO-compatible instruments to respond to that import competition, and I think that we should stick to the principle of WTO compatibility, while being open to explore to what extent China might be ready to offer binding sufficient guarantees which are alternatives to the application of countervailing duties. So I think we should be able to explore whether that's something that China is ready to do. Secondly, there's the challenge about investment policy. I think it's very clear that China is very advanced when it comes to technologies, and it would make sense if there was going to be Chinese investment in Europe that contributes towards technology upgrading, that brings value added to the European Union economy. So I think we need to reflect which are the tools that we can use to incentivize that type of investment, while being clear that investment which is just purely a tariff-hopping assembly operation can be subject to certain type of measures at the European level. So that's the investment policy. Then there's, of course, the issue of disruption of the supply chains. And the industry has been going through a very difficult period because of these export controls coming from China. Now, let's hope that following the conversation that have taken place over the last few weeks, we have entered into a new era of stability, but we know perfectly well that this is very volatile, that is going to depend about what is the evolution of the geopolitical environment. It's clear that in the medium term you need to diversify, but let's be clear, that's not going to happen from one day to the other. Is it possible to obtain some firm guarantees from China against action that disrupt the value chain? I think that should be something that one should be ready to explore, but at the same time being very clear that if China takes action which is of a restrictive nature to close the tap, there's also a response at the European level, and there are tools at the European level which could be used if worse comes to worse. So for me, all of those issues, it will make sense to deal with them comprehensively, to have a discussion with China to see to what extent it is possible to reach some form of understanding that looks into import competition, investment policy, export restrictions, and see where it's possible to reach some form of common understanding. I don't think, however, that that would ever happen unless China perceives that Europe has a unified position and that it is ready to act if need be, and it has instruments of leverage. I think that, for me, is the big challenge when it comes to how to deal with China.
Sarah, you've also focused quite a lot on this topic. Mm-hmm. What do you think of what Ignacio was saying there?
Well, I mean, when it comes to trade policy, I think it's important that we tread carefully, and I think that that is indeed also what Ignacio is saying. But we also shouldn't be naive, and I think that we've been naive for a long time when it comes to, for instance, dependencies, but also when it comes to unfair competition and well, state-funded industry where it is very difficult for our companies to still find a level playing field there. So it's not easy, of course, to find the right balance, I think. But it could be interesting after, I would say, the more immediate response that I think was needed when it comes to tariffs and shielding our markets, to actually build a better understanding between Europe and China on both protecting our industry but also working together in a sense. But then there needs to be checks and balances, right? And I mean, indeed, the joint ventures, the tech transfer, these kind of provisions need to be in place and need to be very clear. I think otherwise this is not going to work. So it's showing teeth in your trade policy, but not going to a straight down protectionism. And I mean, it's a bit the same with the local content requirements or made in Europe, as you will. I think that there are smarter ways, indeed, as Ignacio has said, on framing it than just saying this needs to be Europe made. That you can use resilience criteria, you can use carbon content criteria, etc., where you might even get to the same sort of result without blatantly saying, okay, we are now completely shielding our markets or shielding, for instance, public procurement and some of the demand side parts of the legislation to foreign interference. So I think it should be a balanced approach, is the short answer.
Ignacio, forced joint ventures and tech transfers has been a pretty popular talking point over the past year, but China has its own restrictions on this, on their companies actually exporting some of their key technologies. They see it as a national security issue. So from a trade perspective, how can some of these policies be written in a way that would actually lead to these tech transfers, to these joint ventures? How should European lawmakers be framing this?
I think the main issue is going to be how far you can actually reach a unified position at the European level. Because if we are talking about conditions for investment, let's remember that a lot of the decision making is happening at the member state level. So I think the critical issue here is going to be how can you try to agree on a common policy about Chinese investment on the sector. Now, it is clear that you want to incentivize investment that brings in technology to Europe through joint venture requirements or through other means. I don't think that you need to look only into one particular way of bringing in investment that brings sufficiently value added. And if those investments fulfill those conditions, I think you would need to agree on the conditions at the European level. That investment should basically be treated like any European company in the marketplace, including the possibility of access to different types of incentives. At the same time, if you actually are having an investment which is no more than an assembly operation, that's something that you could argue is a circumvention of the countervailing duties which are being applied at the European Union level. So you can react to it. There are also other tools like the foreign subsidies regulation. So I think you need to be able to, on the one hand, to look into what are the instruments that you can actually do to exercise your leverage, but at the same time, if you can reach a common understanding with China that both sides want to favor a certain type of investment, that would be politically much better than if actually you are having the continuous conflicts. And I totally agree that one should not be naive. That's why, to be very, very clear, when it comes to the issue of potential restrictions of critical raw materials, we should do all that we can to diversify, knowing that it's not going to solve the problem in the next 3-4 years, that it takes longer to be able to diversify. In the meantime, we should really see where we can get guarantees from China that it would not apply export restrictions that disrupt the functioning of the sector. And if they do, quite frankly, we have the anti-coercion instrument, and we could use it in those circumstances. And we need to be prepared to use it in those circumstances.
Still on the topic of China, but slightly different mix. So the sector has been struggling quite a lot recently with chip shortages, thanks to the crisis happening at Nexperia. Now, the last time the sector faced this was during the pandemic. The Commission responded by passing the first CHIPS Act. Here we are again, though, with another CHIPS crisis, and the Commission wants to propose a second CHIPS Act. Sigrid, is that the right approach? If yes, then tell me why. And if not, what should be done, and how should the sector be also working to create resilience in that one company is not going to stop production lines across the entire sector?
Yeah, maybe first of all to say that I agree with much of what was just said about how to deal with China, that you need to find a balanced way, and the resilience and the competitiveness in Europe is not arriving here just by magic. And just to paraphrase what MEP Mathieu just also said, and we need to make sure that Europe becomes an attractive place to work and also to invest. And this is also, by the way, true for the semiconductors. So you need to work on your energy cost, on your permitting speed and procedures, and also on working on these partnerships, strategic partnerships, to then over time reduce your dependencies. And this is also very much true for the semiconductor world, where there are also incredible interdependencies between the United States, China, but also Europe. So they, on the one hand, create a leverage. There is still a way to come to agreements and to deal, and maybe Europe should be slightly more transactional also in these discussions from time to time. But it also is just a fact of life, that these global value chains are so globally integrated, and you cannot just take them apart. You need to live with it and try and manage it in a smart way. So I think it's a very interesting idea that the Commission is now putting forward, this CHIPS Act 2. They've also told us that they would like to really work with the automotive industry to see what that could mean for them. As automotive industry, the first time round, we already said, maybe not just focus so much on the cutting edge, highly advanced, very small chips, but also look at where the demand is in Europe. And I think in Europe, the automotive industry is responsible for between 30 and 40% of demand for chips, but they tend to not be, or not in the majority be, the very advanced, very small ones, because you can use slightly bigger ones in vehicles. But you need a lot of them, and that's what we have seen now also with the Nexperia crisis, that indeed a relatively simple component that is produced at such amounts and with the capacity being in one area of the world, that leads to dependencies. But I think it's easy to say, okay, why is this, and can you not dual source, and can we do that in the future, or can you stockpile? With these amounts, these are simply not the kind of solutions that are easy ways out. So you need to look at how can we diversify supply chains. Can some of that be in Europe, but maybe not, because again, the cost issues, electricity, permitting and so on. So you need partners elsewhere too. But I think it's good that we take another good look at what is possible, what might work. I think the mindset has changed. It's not just about wanting to be cutting edge, but the economic resilience, the security of supply has become more and more important for policymakers, but also for industry. So also in risk management, approaches, we see some changes. So I think this is very interesting. But again, it should not be just something worked out on a drawing board, thinking the world picture perfect. It really needs to have a meaning, and as industry, we're more than willing to come to the table and discuss this together with the Commission. And I think, the Nexperia crisis has only shown how important that in fact is.
Going to shift to some of our online questions. Lucy, one for you. Should batteries be standardized, like 5G or Wi-Fi, with global participation, secure access to the technology, reasonable licensing fees? What do you think?
Oh, well, I'm not going to pretend I'm a battery expert. I will leave that to the car makers. But I think it's good that we have a discussion that is about how do we make sure we're successful in that transition? How do we make sure we accelerate? There are many factors that are part of that discussion. Batteries, one, energy costs were mentioned. I think that's horizontal. It's not even just specific for the automotive sector. We've talked about simplification. Everything in the administration needs to go much, much faster. We're feeling that pain. The car makers are feeling that pain, the suppliers too. Stability of incentives, sustaining demand, all of that. If we can paint a more comprehensive picture, then we can focus on the discussion on how to be successful, how to accelerate in the discussion, rather than having second thoughts.
We have another question along similar vein of how can tech sovereignty be achieved in critical areas like cellular, non-auto technology that cars are more and more reliant upon. Sarah, what do you think?
Tech sovereignty in the sense of, for instance, also the software,
Exactly.
I guess. Yeah, I think it's one of the next big discussions we are going to have, especially now that we see that indeed a lot of the surplus of Chinese vehicles are actually coming to our markets. And of course, it's not just about the cars themselves. There are other parts, I think, of the grid, of the infrastructure, etc., where I would say we also have fragility. It could be strategically dangerous if we don't take into account the fact that, well, actually everything can be accessed, can be controlled from the Chinese perspective. So I think when it comes to cybersecurity, for instance, when it comes to also hybrid warfare, I mean, these are things we need to take into account, and I think that's part it's one of the reasons why I think it's important that we keep the European manufacturer base up and alive, but also that it means that perhaps for some of these things we need to think about protecting what kind of products actually enter our markets, and make sure that when it comes to really crucial parts of our infrastructure, when it comes to also home batteries, for instance, because I mean all of this, the connection of the grid, the bidirectional charging, for instance. I mean, if we do it well, everything in the future is going to be connected to each other. Well, then we need to make sure that this is not, how should I say, an easy point for us to be attacked upon. So I think it's something that we haven't talked about a lot yet in the European debates, but it's an important one. And we, again, shouldn't be naive.
Ignacio, I'm going to give you the last word, because I saw that you wanted to jump in there a couple of times. What are your thoughts?
No. I mean, I agree with what has just been said. I mean, on those issues, you really need to look carefully into what is the nature of the security risk. And if there is a real security risk, you need to look into a risk mitigation action, which is proportionate. But it's clear that if a certain product, technology implies a security risk, it is perfectly legitimate to restrict access in your market to that product.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to our panelists for this really insightful conversation. We did have a poll at the beginning of the discussion, so let's take a look and see how people voted. All right, so the factor that threatens Europe's automotive competitiveness for the next 10 years seems to be almost a tie: trade and geopolitical friction and reliance on non-EU suppliers. So much of what we were just discussing, and the gaps in climate and industrial policy. So hopefully this provided some answers. And thank you to everyone who joined us online. And then for those of us who were on site, we have a little networking session after this. So thank you for all for attending.